Hey everyone! Today we're tackling a question that'll make you rethink everything about medieval business. How medieval merchants built their networks to survive pirates, tax collectors, and church bans. Forget the romantic nonsense about noble knights and fair maidens. The real action was happening in counting houses and caravans, where a handful of traders built networks so sophisticated they'd make modern corporations jealous. Picture this. You're a cloth merchant in 13th century Florence. Your ship just got seized by Genoese pirates. The church just banned you from lending money at interest, and the local duke wants his cut of everything you own. Oh, and winter's coming, which means the Alpine passes are about to close for 6 months. Most people would give up and become farmers. But you've got connections. The medieval world wasn't the isolated local economy your history teacher probably described. By the year 1200, European merchants had built trade networks stretching from London to Constantinople, from Bruges to Alexandria. But here's the thing nobody talks about. These weren't just business relationships. They were survival mechanisms, carefully constructed webs of mutual dependence that could mean the difference between prosperity and bankruptcy, between influence and exile, sometimes between life and death. The merchant class didn't emerge by accident. They filled a gap that neither the church nor the nobility wanted to acknowledge. Somebody had to move goods, manage risk, and handle the messy business of making money. And since nobody else wanted to do it, merchants had to get creative about staying alive while they did it. Take Francesco Datini, a merchant from Prato, who built one of Europe's most extensive trading networks in the 14th century. By the time he died in 1410, he had offices in 16 cities, partnerships with hundreds of traders, and account books that would make a modern auditor weep with joy. But Datini didn't start with money or connections. He started with one thing: the understanding that in a world where everyone wanted to rob you, tax you, or excommunicate you, your network was your lifeline. The genius of medieval merchant networks wasn't just their scope, it was their redundancy. If pirates took your ship in the Mediterranean, you had partners in Genoa who could cover your losses. If a king seized your assets in France, you had cousins in the Low Countries who could extend credit. If the church declared your lending practices usurious, you had Jewish partners who could handle the transactions that Christians weren't supposed to touch. But building these networks required more than just business sense. It required navigating a maze of competing authorities, conflicting laws, and ancient prejudices. Every merchant had to be part diplomat, part spy, and part psychologist. You had to know which bishops could be bought, which pirates could be negotiated with, and which tax collectors would accept a reasonable bribe instead of seizing everything you owned. The stakes couldn't have been higher. In a world without insurance companies, central banks, or international law, merchants were operating entirely on trust and reputation. One broken contract, one betrayed confidence, one miscalculated risk could destroy decades of careful relationship building. Yet somehow, they made it work. The foundation of every merchant network was something that sounds almost quaint today: personal relationships. But in the medieval world, where legal systems were inconsistent and communication took weeks, personal trust wasn't just nice to have, it was the only currency that really mattered. Medieval merchants understood something that modern businesses often forget. In uncertain environments, relationships aren't just about networking, they're about survival. When Jacques Coeur, the legendary French merchant of the 15th century, wanted to expand his trade routes into the Ottoman Empire, he didn't just hire local agents. He married his business partner's daughters to his sons, sent his nephews to live with Turkish merchants, and spent years learning Arabic and Turkish customs. This wasn't sentiment, it was strategy. In a world where contracts were often verbal and enforcement was spotty, family ties were the closest thing you could get to a guarantee. If your business partner's son was married to your daughter, he had a powerful incentive not to cheat you. If your agent in Constantinople was your nephew, you could trust him with your life savings. But family networks had limits. You could only have so many relatives, and they couldn't be everywhere at once. So, successful merchants developed what we might call fictive kinship, formal relationships that carried the weight of family obligations without the actual blood ties. The most common form was the partnership agreement, but these weren't just business contracts. They were quasi-familial bonds that included obligations to house each other's children, provide dowries for each other's daughters, and offer sanctuary in times of trouble. When Giovanni de' Medici formed his banking partnerships in the early 15th century, he wasn't just creating business entities, he was building an extended family network that would support Medici interests across Europe for generations. Then there were the religious brotherhoods, confraternities that brought together merchants from the same region or trade. These weren't just social clubs. They were mutual aid societies, intelligence networks, and political lobbying groups all rolled into one. The German merchants in London formed the Hanseatic League's English chapter, which provided everything from warehouse space to legal representation to emergency loans. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of medieval merchant networks was how they navigated religious and ethnic boundaries. In theory, Christians weren't supposed to lend money at interest, Jews weren't supposed to own land, and Muslims weren't supposed to trade with infidels. In practice, merchants found ways around all of these restrictions through carefully constructed partnerships. A Christian merchant might form a silent partnership with a Jewish moneylender, providing the capital while the Jewish partner handled the actual lending. A Muslim trader might work through a Christian agent in European markets, while the Christian used Muslim contacts for access to Asian goods. These arrangements required incredible trust and sophisticated legal frameworks, but they allowed merchants to access markets and services that would otherwise have been forbidden. The key was plausible deniability. Everyone involved had to be able to maintain the fiction that they weren't violating religious law, even when everyone knew exactly what was happening. This created a complex web of coded communications, intermediary agents, and shell partnerships that made medieval merchant networks look almost like modern offshore banking schemes. Nothing tested merchant networks like piracy, and in the medieval world, piracy was everywhere. The Mediterranean swarmed with Barbary corsairs, Genoese raiders, and freelance adventurers. The North Sea and Baltic were hunting grounds for pirates from every coastal kingdom. Even river trade wasn't safe. Bandits operated along the Rhine, the Seine, and every other major waterway in Europe. But here's where medieval merchants showed their genius. Instead of just accepting piracy as a cost of doing business, they developed systematic approaches to minimize the risk and share the losses when prevention failed. The most basic strategy was convoy sailing. Merchants would coordinate their shipping schedules so that multiple vessels could travel together with armed escorts. The Venetian state organized official convoys, called mude, that sailed at regular intervals to major trading destinations. Private merchants could book space on these convoys for a fee, guaranteeing both protection and reliable scheduling. But convoys were expensive and inflexible, so merchants developed more creative solutions. They started dividing their cargo among multiple ships, spreading the risk so that losing one vessel wouldn't wipe them out completely. They coordinated with competitors to share intelligence about pirate activity, creating informal early warning networks that could alert traders to avoid certain routes or timing. Some merchants went even further, forming what amounted to private navies. The Hanseatic League, that confederation of German trading cities, maintained its own fleet of warships specifically to protect merchant vessels. They didn't just react to piracy, they actively hunted pirates, captured their ships, and hanged their crews as examples to others. The most audacious approach was negotiation. Some merchants discovered that pirates, like any other business people, could be reasoned with. They negotiated protection agreements, essentially paying pirates not to attack their ships. This sounds like extortion, and it was, but it was often cheaper than armed escorts and more reliable than hoping for the best. Andrea Barbarigo, a Venetian merchant of the 15th century, kept detailed records of his anti-piracy expenses, and they're fascinating. He paid for convoy fees, hired guards, bought insurance from private investors, and yes, occasionally paid customs to known pirates. His accounts show that he treated piracy as just another business expense to be managed, not an existential threat to be feared. The insurance arrangements were particularly clever. Groups of merchants would pool their resources to create mutual insurance funds. If one member lost a ship to pirates, the others would cover his losses. But the system only worked if everyone contributed honestly and no one tried to game the system by claiming false losses or taking unnecessary risks. This required sophisticated record-keeping and reputation monitoring. Merchant guilds maintained detailed records of who had suffered losses, how much they had contributed to common funds, and whether their claims seemed legitimate. A merchant who developed a reputation for suspicious losses would find himself excluded from future insurance pools, and in the medieval world, exclusion from merchant networks could be a death sentence. The most successful merchants learned to use multiple strategies simultaneously. They'd book space on protected convoys when possible, maintain insurance arrangements with their networks, gather intelligence about pirate activity, and keep enough liquid assets in different locations to weather temporary losses. Tax collectors were arguably more dangerous than pirates because they had the law on their side. Every kingdom, duchy, city-state, and petty lordship wanted its cut of merchant profits, and the competing claims often contradicted each other. A merchant might pay export taxes in his home city, transit taxes at every border crossing, import taxes at his destination, and market taxes for the privilege of selling his goods. And that was just the beginning. The real nightmare was arbitrary taxation. Kings, facing military expenses, or nobles needing cash for their latest castle, would simply declare new taxes on whatever seemed profitable at the moment. Edward I of England famously seized all foreign merchants' assets in 1294 to fund his wars in France and Scotland. Philip the Fair of France did the same thing repeatedly, targeting Italian bankers whenever he needed quick cash. But medieval merchants were nothing if not adaptable. They developed strategies that would make modern tax lawyers proud. The first defense was diversification, not just of investments, but of legal identity. Successful merchants maintained citizenship or trading privileges in multiple jurisdictions, so they could choose which laws applied to any given transaction. Francesco Datini held citizenship papers from Prato, Avignon, and Florence, and trading privileges in England, France, and the Low Countries. When one government became too grasping, he could shift his operations to another jurisdiction. The second strategy was what we might call legal arbitrage, exploiting differences between competing legal systems. Canon law forbade Christians from charging interest, but civil law often allowed penalties for late payment. Islamic law had different rules about partnership profits than Christian law. Jewish law permitted certain transactions that both Christian and Islamic law forbade. Clever merchants structured their deals to take advantage of whichever legal system was most favorable. A Christian merchant, lending money to a Muslim trader, might structure the deal as a Islamic murabaha contract, which looked like a goods transaction but functioned like a loan. A partnership between Christian and Jewish merchants might be governed by Jewish law in some respects and Christian law in others, depending on which was more advantageous. The third approach was political insurance. Merchants invested heavily in relationships with rulers, nobles, and church officials who could protect them from arbitrary taxation. This wasn't just bribery, though there was plenty of that, but long-term relationship building that created mutual dependence. The Medici Bank became indispensable to the papal treasury, handling everything from collecting church revenues to financing papal building projects. This gave them enormous influence over church policy and protection from religious restrictions on banking. When hostile popes tried to crack down on Medici practices, they discovered that doing so would bankrupt the church itself. Similarly, Jacques Coeur became so essential to the French royal finances that Charles VII couldn't afford to alienate him, even when nobles complained about Coeur's growing wealth and influence. Coeur handled everything from provisioning the royal household to financing military campaigns, making himself indispensable to the functioning of the French state. But the most sophisticated tax avoidance strategy was network coordination. Merchant families and trading companies would coordinate their activities across multiple jurisdictions to minimize their total tax burden. They'd time transactions to take advantage of temporary tax exemptions, route goods through jurisdictions with favorable treaty arrangements, and use transfer pricing between their own subsidiaries to shift profits to low-tax locations. The Fugger banking family of Augsburg became masters of this approach. They maintained operations in dozens of cities across the Holy Roman Empire and beyond, constantly shifting resources and legal structures to minimize taxation while maximizing political protection. Their account books show a level of tax planning sophistication that wouldn't be out of place in a modern multinational corporation. The Catholic Church presented merchants with their most complex challenge because it controlled both temporal and spiritual authority. The Church could excommunicate you, declare your business practices sinful, and convince secular authorities to confiscate your property, all while claiming divine sanction for its actions. The fundamental problem was usury. Canon law strictly forbade Christians from lending money at interest, considering it a form of theft. But medieval commerce was impossible without credit arrangements, and merchants needed to charge for the risks they took in lending money. This created a theological and practical nightmare that required incredible creativity to navigate. Some merchants tried direct confrontation, arguing that certain types of interest weren't really usury. They claimed that penalties for late payment weren't interest but compensation for damages. They argued that currency exchange fees weren't usury but payment for legitimate services. They maintained that partnership profits weren't interest but shared risk-taking. These arguments sometimes worked, especially when backed by generous donations to the church. But they were dangerous because they put merchants at the mercy of changing theological fashions and hostile clergy. Smarter merchants developed indirect approaches that kept them technically within church law while achieving the same practical results. The most common was the partnership arrangement. Instead of lending money at interest, a merchant would form a partnership with a borrower, providing capital in exchange for a share of profits. If the venture failed, the merchant lost his money. If it succeeded, he earned a return that looked like business profit rather than loan interest. Another approach was the bill of exchange, which became the foundation of international medieval finance. Instead of lending money directly, merchants would buy and sell IOUs denominated in different currencies and payable in different locations. The profit came from currency fluctuations and geographic arbitrage rather than explicit interest charges. These instruments were genuinely useful for legitimate trade. A merchant in London who needed to pay a supplier in Florence could buy a bill of exchange rather than shipping actual coins across Europe. But they also allowed sophisticated forms of credit that looked nothing like traditional loans. The most audacious approach was partnership with non-Christians. Since Jews and Muslims weren't bound by Christian usury laws, they could engage in financial practices that were forbidden to Christians. Clever merchants formed partnerships with Jewish and Muslim financiers, providing capital while their partners handled the actual lending. These arrangements required careful legal structures to maintain plausible deniability for the Christian partners. Often, the Christian merchant would claim to be merely depositing money for safekeeping, while the Jewish or Muslim partner would claim to be investing his own capital. The profits would be split according to private agreements that were never written down or were disguised as payments for other services. Some merchant families went even further, maintaining parallel financial operations in Christian and non-Christian jurisdictions. The Christian operation would handle activities that were clearly permissible under canon law, while the non-Christian operation would handle everything else. Profits could be shifted between the operations through various mechanisms that appeared to be legitimate business transactions. The most successful merchants also invested heavily in theological education and church relationships. They endowed monasteries, funded church construction projects, and maintained close relationships with influential clergy who could provide both practical advice and spiritual protection. When theological disputes arose about specific business practices, these merchants had allies who could argue their case or provide advance warning of changing church policies. By the 14th century, the most successful merchant networks had evolved into something unprecedented in European history. Multinational corporations with sophisticated management structures, standardized accounting practices, and coordinated strategies that spanned continents. The Medici Bank, at its height in the mid-15th century, operated like a modern financial services company. It had branches in 16 cities, from London to Constantinople, each functioning as both a local bank and a node in the larger network. The branches offered commercial banking, investment services, currency exchange, and trade finance. They maintained correspondent relationships with hundreds of smaller banks and trading companies, creating a financial network that reached into every corner of European commerce. But the real innovation was in management structure. Instead of trying to control everything from Florence, the Medici developed a system of semi-autonomous partnerships. Each branch was legally a separate entity, owned jointly by the central bank and local partners who understood their markets intimately. This structure allowed for local adaptation while maintaining overall coordination and shared resources. The accounting systems were equally sophisticated. Every branch maintained detailed books using double-entry accounting principles that allowed for precise tracking of assets, liabilities, and profits across the entire network. Regular reports flowed back to Florence, where analysts could monitor performance, identify trends, and coordinate strategic decisions. The Medici also pioneered what we'd now call risk management. They maintained detailed intelligence networks that tracked political developments, military campaigns, economic trends, and even weather patterns that might affect trade routes. They diversified their investments across different industries, geographic regions, and types of assets. They maintained multiple backup plans for every major operation, ensuring that temporary setbacks in one area couldn't destroy the entire enterprise. The Fugger banking family took these concepts even further. By the early 16th century, they had essentially cornered the European market for certain types of mining and metallurgy, while also maintaining one of the continent's largest banking operations. They provided credit to kings and emperors, financed papal elections, and controlled enough of the silver and copper trade to influence European monetary policy. But perhaps the most impressive merchant network was the Hanseatic League, which wasn't centered on a single family or company, but represented a confederation of trading cities that coordinated their activities for mutual benefit. At its peak in the 14th century, the League included over 100 cities and controlled most of the trade in the North Sea and Baltic. The League's genius was its ability to coordinate without centralized control. Member cities maintained their independence while agreeing to common policies on trade routes, piracy suppression, market access, and diplomatic relations. They established common standards for weights, measures, and currency exchange. They negotiated collective agreements with foreign powers that gave League merchants preferential treatment throughout Northern Europe. When conflicts arose with non-League powers, the entire confederation could coordinate responses. They imposed trade boycotts, organized military campaigns, and negotiated as a unified bloc with far more power than any individual city could muster. The League's fleet was strong enough to challenge royal navies, and its economic influence was sufficient to make or break kingdoms that depended on Baltic trade. These networks also developed sophisticated communication systems that allowed for coordination across vast distances. They maintained chains of messengers who could carry letters from London to Constantinople in as little as 6 weeks. They developed coded languages and ciphers to protect sensitive commercial information. They established standardized procedures for everything from cargo inspection to currency exchange that allowed partners who had never met to conduct complex transactions with confidence. The most successful networks also invested heavily in infrastructure. They built and maintained roads, bridges, and harbors that facilitated trade. They established warehouses, counting houses, and residential facilities in major trading centers. They funded map-making, navigation improvements, and harbor dredging projects that benefited all merchants but particularly advantaged network members who had advanced knowledge of the improvements. The success of medieval merchant networks created an unexpected problem. They became too powerful for traditional authorities to ignore or control. By the 15th century, merchant families and trading companies commanded resources that rivaled kingdoms, influenced papal elections, and could make or break royal finances through their lending decisions. This power attracted attention from rulers who wanted to harness merchant wealth for their own purposes, and from competitors who wanted to destroy merchant influence entirely. The resulting conflicts would reshape European politics and economics for centuries to come. Kings and emperors discovered that they could use merchant networks as tools of diplomacy and warfare. Merchants could gather intelligence in foreign courts, influence foreign policy through their lending decisions, and provide the financial resources necessary for military campaigns. But they could also withdraw their support at critical moments, leaving rulers financially stranded. Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire learned this lesson painfully when he became dependent on Fugger financing for his wars against France and the Ottoman Empire. The Fuggers provided millions of florins for military campaigns, but they also demanded political concessions, trading privileges, and territorial grants that effectively gave them control over large portions of imperial policy. When Charles tried to reduce his dependence on Fugger loans, he discovered that alternative financing sources were limited and expensive. The Fuggers had relationships with other major banking families that allowed them to coordinate responses to imperial pressure. They could manipulate currency markets, restrict credit availability, and influence the decisions of other lenders in ways that made independent royal finance nearly impossible. Similar dynamics played out across Europe. The French monarchy became dependent on Italian banking networks for financing its Italian wars, giving Florentine and Genoese merchants enormous influence over French foreign policy. English kings found themselves at the mercy of Flemish and German traders who controlled wool exports and cloth imports essential to English economic stability. But merchant power also generated backlash from traditional elites who resented the influence of mere traders over political decisions. Nobles complained that merchants were corrupting traditional hierarchies by buying their way into aristocratic society. Clergy argued that commercial values were undermining Christian principles. Royal administrators resented having to negotiate with merchants rather than simply commanding their obedience. These tensions exploded into violence repeatedly throughout the later medieval period. The Ciompi Revolt in Florence in 1378 saw wool workers and small merchants attempt to overthrow the oligarchy of great merchant families that controlled the city. The Peasants' Revolt in England in 1381 included attacks on foreign merchants who were blamed for economic exploitation of English workers. More dangerously for merchants, some rulers decided to break their dependence on merchant networks through confiscation and expulsion. Edward I's seizure of foreign merchant assets in 1294 was just one example of a pattern that repeated throughout Europe. Philip the Fair's destruction of the Knights Templar in 1307 was partly motivated by his desire to eliminate a banking network that had become too powerful to control. The most devastating example was the expulsion of Jews from various European kingdoms throughout the 13th and 14th centuries. These expulsions weren't just motivated by religious prejudice. They were also calculated attempts to destroy financial networks that had become too independent and influential for royal comfort. Jewish merchants and financiers had built some of Europe's most sophisticated trading networks, connecting Christian, Islamic, and Jewish commercial centers across vast distances. Their expulsion from England in 1290, from France in 1306, and from various German territories throughout the 14th century wasn't just a humanitarian catastrophe. It was an economic disaster that disrupted trade routes and credit arrangements across the continent. But the most successful merchant networks proved remarkably resilient in the face of these challenges. They adapted by diversifying their political relationships, building stronger legal protections, and developing contingency plans for dealing with hostile authorities. The networks that survived into the early modern period would provide the foundation for the global trading companies that would dominate the age of exploration. The transformation of merchant networks from survival mechanisms into engines of economic expansion reached its climax in the late 15th and early 16th centuries. What had begun as defensive arrangements to protect traders from pirates, tax collectors, and church bands had evolved into the organizational foundation for European expansion into Africa, Asia, and the Americas. The Portuguese expansion into the Indian Ocean, beginning with Vasco da Gama's voyage in 1497, was financed and organized using network structures that medieval merchants had spent centuries perfecting. Portuguese trading companies combined royal backing with private investment, used established techniques for managing long-distance partnerships, and applied sophisticated risk-sharing arrangements to ventures that were far more dangerous and uncertain than traditional European trade. But the real breakthrough came with the development of joint stock companies, which allowed merchants to mobilize unprecedented amounts of capital for overseas expansion while limiting individual risk exposure. The Dutch East India Company, chartered in 1602, was essentially a medieval merchant network scaled up and formalized with government backing. The company's structure would have been familiar to a 14th-century Medici banker. Semi-autonomous regional operations, sophisticated accounting systems, diversified investment portfolios, and extensive intelligence networks. But it operated on a scale that medieval merchants could never have imagined, with permanent military forces, territorial control, and diplomatic authority that rivaled European kingdoms. The success of these early modern trading companies validated the organizational principles that medieval merchants had developed through centuries of trial and error. The emphasis on relationship building, risk sharing, and network coordination proved just as effective for managing trade routes to Asia as it had been for surviving church bans in Europe. But the transformation also revealed the darker implications of merchant network success. The same organizational capabilities that had allowed medieval traders to survive hostile authorities were now being used to exploit and subjugate populations across the globe. The techniques that had once protected merchants from pirates were now being used to establish commercial empires based on military force and economic exploitation. The Atlantic slave trade, in particular, was organized using network structures that traced their origins back to medieval commercial practices. The complex partnerships, credit arrangements, and risk-sharing mechanisms that had once facilitated legitimate commerce were now being applied to the systematic exploitation of human beings on an unprecedented scale. Yet even as merchant networks evolved into instruments of global expansion and exploitation, they retained many of the characteristics that had made them successful survival mechanisms in medieval Europe. The emphasis on personal relationships, the importance of reputation and trust, the need for sophisticated communication and coordination, all of these remained central to commercial success. The great merchant families of the early modern period, the Fuggers, the Welsers, the Hochstädters, operated using principles that would have been immediately recognizable to Francesco Datini or Jacques Coeur. They built their success on networks of personal relationships, managed risk through diversification and partnership arrangements, and navigated complex political environments by maintaining multiple allegiances and backup plans. But they also operated on a scale and with a level of resources that transformed the nature of merchant power. Where medieval merchants had sought primarily to survive and prosper within existing political structures, early modern merchant networks had the capacity to reshape those structures entirely. The Habsburg Empire in the 16th century was, in many respects, a Fugger client state, dependent on German banking networks for its basic financial functioning. The Dutch Republic was essentially a confederation of merchant oligarchies that had formalized their commercial networks into political institutions. The English monarchy discovered that its global ambitions were impossible without the cooperation of London's merchant community. The question we started with, how medieval merchants built networks to survive pirates, tax collectors, and church bans, turns out to have an answer that goes far beyond mere survival. These networks didn't just protect merchants from external threats. They fundamentally transformed the nature of power and authority in European society. Medieval merchants created something that hadn't existed since the fall of Rome, a truly international system of economic coordination that operated independently of political and religious authorities. They built institutions that could function across cultural and linguistic boundaries, legal systems that could handle complex multi-party transactions, and communication networks that could coordinate activities across vast distances. The survival techniques they developed, diversification, partnership, relationship building, risk sharing, became the organizational foundation for European expansion and ultimately for the global economic system that emerged in the early modern period. The same principles that allowed a 14th-century Florentine cloth merchant to navigate between hostile Italian city-states would later enable Dutch and English trading companies to establish commercial empires spanning multiple continents. But the story of medieval merchant networks also reveals the double-edged nature of organizational innovation. The techniques that allowed merchants to survive external threats also gave them the power to become threats themselves. The networks that had once been defensive mechanisms became instruments of exploitation and control. The merchant families and trading companies that emerged from the medieval period weren't just businesses. They were proto-states with their own military forces, diplomatic services, and territorial ambitions. They used their organizational advantages not just to compete with traditional authorities, but to replace them entirely in many contexts. The Hanseatic League, at its peak, effectively controlled the governments of dozens of German cities and exercised sovereign authority over large portions of the Baltic Sea. The Medici Bank became so central to papal finances that it could influence church policy and even papal elections. The great German banking families accumulated so much wealth and influence that they could make or break imperial ambitions across Central Europe. This transformation from survival mechanism to power structure reveals something fundamental about organizational innovation. Successful adaptations to hostile environments often end up reshaping those environments entirely. Medieval merchants didn't just learn to cope with pirates, tax collectors, and church bans. They ultimately created systems that made these traditional threats irrelevant. By the 16th century, the most successful merchant networks had evolved beyond the need for purely defensive strategies. They commanded enough resources to maintain their own military forces, enough political influence to shape taxation policies, and enough financial leverage to negotiate as equals with church authorities. The techniques that had once been necessary for mere survival, the complex partnerships, the international coordination, the sophisticated financial instruments had become the tools for reshaping European society according to commercial rather than traditional principles. The networks that medieval merchants built to survive hostile authorities ended up creating the organizational foundation for the modern world economy. The same principles of risk sharing, relationship building, and institutional innovation that allowed 13th century traders to navigate between competing jurisdictions would later enable European merchants to establish global trading networks that connected every inhabited continent. But they also created new forms of inequality and exploitation that were arguably more systematic and extensive than anything that had existed in the medieval world. The organizational capabilities that had once been used defensively were now being applied to establish commercial dominance over entire populations and geographic regions. The legacy of medieval merchant networks extends far beyond their immediate historical context. The organizational principles they developed, Network coordination, risk sharing, relationship-based trust, institutional innovation became the foundation for virtually every major economic and political development of the early modern period. When we look at the great exploration ventures of the 15th and 16th centuries, we're seeing medieval merchant network principles applied to global expansion. The Portuguese and Spanish colonial empires, the Dutch and English trading companies, even the early slave trading networks. All of these were built using organizational techniques that had been perfected by medieval European merchants facing much smaller-scale survival challenges. The financial innovations that emerged from medieval merchant networks, bills of exchange, double-entry accounting, partnership agreements, risk-sharing mechanisms became the foundation for modern banking and finance. The legal innovations, commercial law, international arbitration, standardized contracts provided the framework for modern business practice. Perhaps most importantly, medieval merchant networks demonstrated that economic coordination could operate independently of traditional political and religious authorities. This was a revolutionary concept that would reshape European society and ultimately contribute to the development of modern capitalism, democratic governance, and international law. The merchant networks that began as defensive responses to medieval hostility ended up creating the organizational foundation for European global dominance. The same techniques that had allowed traders to survive in a fragmented, violent, and arbitrary medieval world proved extraordinarily effective for establishing commercial empires across multiple continents. But the story also reveals the unintended consequences of successful adaptation. The merchants who built these networks were primarily concerned with their own survival and prosperity. They weren't trying to reshape European society or establish global dominance. They were just trying to stay in business in a hostile environment. Yet their innovations had effects that went far beyond their original intentions. The networks they built to protect themselves from medieval authorities ultimately created new forms of authority that were arguably more powerful and extensive than anything that had existed before. The great irony is that the defensive strategies developed by medieval merchants to survive external threats ended up making them the dominant force in European society. The networks built to protect commerce from political interference ultimately gave merchants more political power than kings and emperors had ever wielded. When you trace the organizational lineage from medieval merchant partnerships to modern multinational corporations, from Hanseatic League coordination to international trade agreements, from Medici banking innovations to modern financial markets, you're following a direct line of institutional evolution that spans more than 7 centuries. The merchants who built these networks solved a fundamental problem that still challenges modern organizations: how to coordinate complex activities across cultural, legal, and geographic boundaries while managing multiple forms of risk and uncertainty. Their solutions, emphasizing relationships over rules, networks over hierarchies, adaptation over control, remain relevant for anyone trying to operate in complex, uncertain environments. The medieval merchants who learned to survive pirates, tax collectors, and church bans didn't just save their own businesses, they created the organizational foundation for the modern world. Their networks became the template for every major form of international coordination that followed, from trading companies to diplomatic alliances to multinational corporations. The survival mechanisms they developed in response to medieval hostility became the tools for reshaping human society on a global scale. And that transformation is still continuing today, as modern organizations grapple with challenges that would have been familiar to any medieval merchant: how to coordinate across boundaries, manage multiple forms of risk, and maintain trust in uncertain environments. The story of medieval merchant networks is ultimately a story about the unintended consequences of organizational innovation. What began as a desperate attempt to survive in a hostile world ended up creating the foundation for a new kind of world entirely. One organized around commercial rather than traditional principles. One that prioritized economic efficiency over social stability. One that made possible both unprecedented prosperity and unprecedented exploitation. Those medieval merchants who worried about surviving the next pirate attack or tax assessment ended up building the organizational foundation for European global dominance. They solved their immediate problems so effectively that they inadvertently created new kinds of problems that we're still dealing with today. But they also demonstrated something profound about human adaptability and organizational innovation. When faced with seemingly impossible challenges, surviving in a world where everyone wanted to rob you, tax you, or excommunicate you, they found ways not just to survive, but to thrive. And in doing so, they changed the world.